Hi, this is Deb, and welcome to this databeats jam session. Arpit and I from databeats sat on this conversation with Justin Goff, Senior Product Manager at Raptor Technologies and co-founder at FrontRangeInsights, to discuss vendor selection in a very interesting scenario. Let's learn more about Justin's context and how it went down. So Justin, can you begin with a quick introduction about yourself and your context?
Awesome. Yeah. I'm really happy to be here. I've been a fan of your work for a while, and I'm glad to finally get a chance to contribute. My name's Justin. I'm a product manager after starting my career as a classroom teacher. Now, I've been in product management for about 10 years now, and all of that's been in EdTech. Within EdTech, though, I've worked at a pretty wide variety of companies. Probably heard about. I was at Power School for a while, so that's a K-12 B2B SaaS product for student data management, and also at Duolingo for a while, right? So that's a B2C consumer subscription app for language learning. And currently, I'm working on a K-12 B2B product again. And that's the product we're going to talk about when we look at this evaluation process. I'm also geek about this space and have recently paired up with the former colleague of mine who's a data engineer. And we're starting a small consulting firm to help people get better, both the process of evaluating solutions and then actually we're equipped to help implement them as well. Cool. So where do you want to start?
I'm absolutely stoked to have this conversation with you, Justin, because there are so many things that you just mentioned in your introduction. I've been a product manager at healthcare, automotive, but right now, for the first time in my life, I'm working as a head of product at a vendor. There's very interesting dynamics where it's the stakeholders, the relationship between data engineering, product management, and all of these things, how they influence or play
Mhm.
with this entire game of evaluating products. It has opportunity to improve, I would just say. So I'm actually
Yeah.
curious to learn about the detail in the context, and I'm absolutely also excited and stoked about the fact that you are creating something with someone else to help with this process, because
Mhm.
I think we need more of that in every domain. Why don't you start with the edtech context in which you even need to evaluate? Think of it as what
Mhm.
would trigger someone, because not all of B2B is looking for a solution. Like, why would
Right.
you even
Right.
evaluate solutions?
So I think there are a couple things coming together for us at Raptor, which is where I'm currently working, that caused us to start looking for an event-based product analytics system and to start building out a stack for that. I think one of the threads was that we were realizing how difficult it had become to actually measure the impact of the work we were doing. And for a variety of reasons, the design that works best for a production database is pretty much the opposite of the design that works best for an analytics database. And as we grew, that was just becoming more and more painful trying to rely on our production data. There were also a lot of gaps in the production data, right? I mean, the kinds of things you want to store in production, they don't cover all the kinds of user behaviors that you want to analyze, right? And so we were kind of in that classic position of needing to have an event tracking system to get a better sense of what our end users were doing. Now, why that's particularly important for our product, right? In a lot of K-12 B2B contexts, you're selling to school administrators, but the day-to-day users are not school administrators. They're teachers, students, and parents. And you can sell to the administrator, but customer retention is highly dependent on user engagement. And so we were lacking the tools to increase user engagement and really like in you know, B2B inflected flavors of like your classic pirate metrics, right? We want new users to activate quickly. We want them to develop regular habits of using the product. And even in some cases, we want to be able to do some, again, like modified A/B tests around those specific end user behaviors. And we were pretty late to the game for this, and I think that's common for K-12 B2B ed tech companies because until the like current generation of warehouse native product analytics tools, it was really hard to meet the privacy requirements, both like legal requirements and like customer expectations around student data privacy with the previous generation of analytics tools. That's no longer true, but I think K-12 ed tech practitioners are kind of late to catch up to that. Like we can have nice things now when it comes to product analytics. It's not the old days where you had to build it all yourself. So that's the context where we were starting this. I think one really interesting piece that you'll notice as we get into the story, though, is that we started this process right before getting acquired. So the initial context was we were looking for something scrappy we could set up for a fast moving startup. And one of the luxuries of being a small startup is, you can accept a little extra privacy risk because you're more likely to sort of fly under the radar and you're less subject to scrutiny. We were a hall pass product where like we were a little further away from a lot of hot button privacy topics, but we were acquired by a pretty comprehensive school safety platform that like lives day to day in some of the like in some really high sensitivity data. And so as we were starting to think about a solution for that new context, our requirements changed partway through.
Double click a couple of things. You mentioned a lot of different aspects that I was just like noting down to think about a scenario where you first began by stating that the initial databases and the software and the systems that you had were not able
Hmm.
to deliver to you what you wanted to observe, which was more like event based. What was that like? I mean, how would you describe the scenario where people are like, oh, I want to do this, but we
Hmm.
can't? And how much time did you spend in that before you were like, okay, maybe we should think about something? Because I think there is companies of different shapes and sizes. There would be this period of like you can live with the problem and then
Hmm.
it
Hmm.
becomes hot enough for you to like do something about it, right?
Yeah. So I think there are probably a couple ways of thinking about that. One way is that like as we grew as SmartPass, that was the company before we were acquired. We were bringing in more people who had like less comprehensive knowledge of our production database,
Mm.
and that's required to turn that production data into an insight, even if you assume that you're really great at SQL, right? Like that's required. Like the capacity we had to use SQL to work through that problem, it just wasn't as high as it was when it was a small team that was really familiar with that production data. I think another thing that happened over time is that, which again is common for startups, is that the ratio of non-technical people who needed to know things to technical people who needed to know things like kept going up, right?
Mm.
And so that was another reason why, we were using Metabase, right? And you could go into Metabase and we had a copy of our production database in BigQuery, right? So you could go into Metabase, you could use Metabase's, query builder, but still
Mm.
required a pretty solid knowledge of the database itself and how the schema works. But to really
Mm.
do anything sophisticated, you needed to get into some pretty gnarly SQL queries pretty quickly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Even with tools like, Claude, which is really good at writing SQL queries,
Mm.
it still took a long time and was pretty error prone, right? It was hard to trust the data. But I think the like proximate cause was actually, we wanted to get better at understanding which customers were at the highest risk of churn. And
Ah,
like we needed product behaviors for that because again,
okay.
customer user engagement is one of the strongest predictors of customer retention in this kind of business. And that's where we really
Nice.
started to notice the gaps in our production data. There was just a lot of stuff that was going to be hard to answer.
Yeah.
It's also one of many reasons why we decided to go warehouse native from the start, because, again, we're not a B2C business. I think a
Mm.
lot of the like all-in-one SaaS tools out there, like a Mixpanel, for instance, they can do some B2B stuff, but they have some pretty strong assumptions baked in around B2C metrics. But also as an education company, there are a lot of other entities that we need to treat as
Mm.
first-class citizens, right? We can't get by with just users and events.
Yeah.
For example, like one of the key metrics we really care about for customer health is actually a metric we designed called active rooms. Now, the weird thing about the hall pass thing is you can be using the hall pass system without ever like touching a device, right? So if I'm a
Mm.
student and I ask my teacher for a hall pass and the teacher issues a digital hall pass to me, and then I use it to go to a class, to go to a different room and then come back. Like as a student, I'm using the hall pass. Like that's user engagement, right? But only the teacher is actually touching the product. And so what actually mattered to us is not counting the number of unique users, right? Because either the student could create the pass or the teacher could create the pass, right? The number of unique users could vary a lot based on factors that had nothing to do with actual user engagement. And so we started counting active rooms, right? Like, so the theory there is that if a customer sets up rooms, like physical rooms in the software, because they expect people to create passes to or from that room. And so our metric is all focused on active rooms. And an active room is any room that either is the origin or the destination of a pass within a given time period. And so, like to us, that was one of two big reasons why, from the start, we kind of limited our search to warehouse native options. The other one being the, data privacy reasons, right? Like um, the fewer steps in the process that involve third-party data processing,
Mm, mm.
just the lower the risk, both in terms of legal risk, but even more importantly, in terms of like messaging risk around student data privacy.
If you think about the aspect of privacy, and you mentioned a point earlier that the buyer could be an admin, but the user is the teacher, and maybe even by
Hmm.
extension the student, right? Could you speak a little bit more to what this would entail? You already started sharing about like the room and the hall, but
Hmm.
how do you deal with compliance and privacy from a regulatory aspect as a business, and how do different users
Hmm.
have different needs in your context?
Sure. I'm not like a lawyer or an expert on compliance, but over the years, I've developed a few useful rules of thumb, and compliance with data privacy laws in the United States is a lot easier if everything lives on your own stack. And so, again, one of those rules of thumb is you reduce third party data handling, you eliminate third party data storage, and it's a lot easier both to be compliant with, FERPA, for instance, and it's a lot easier to explain to customers how you're compliant, right? So a message that's, hey, the student data never leaves our servers, right, it's a much easier message to deliver than the student data mostly doesn't leave our servers except for this one exception, and here's why that exception is okay. Even if, right, that exception could be okay, and you could implement that exception in a way that is FERPA compliant, but like, you're in a 30-minute sales call and someone's asking hard questions about data privacy. That's just not a conversation you want to have, right? You just want to say, nope, everything lives on our servers. We're not dealing with any third parties with the student information.
Okay, that makes sense. Another question. How did you come up with the metrics that you wanted to track
Yeah.
about engagement?
Yeah, yeah. And so that's fun. That's actually one of the other areas our consulting firm is set up to work on, partly because, again, I'm just like a huge geek about this and I love it. So like the very first thing we started with was trying to think about like what are the concrete user behaviors that translate to value for the customer, right? So there you're looking at what are the key jobs to be done that the customer has hired the software to do, and how can you measure the volume of that job that's getting done, right? So we knew for us it was going to be something around pass creation, right? Because the core job people were hiring this product to do was to create hall passes, right? And that captured the like more abstract need that our customers have, which is to understand where students are, and especially to understand when students are in a different place from where they would normally be, right? So when are they not in the class that they would normally be in? Great. So, pass creation. If school's creating a lot of passes, then they're more engaged than if they're not creating passes at all. A couple problems with that though. We have a huge variation in the size of each customer, right? So obviously we needed a way to normalize the pass creation metric across just like a really diverse customer set. The other problem is that there are a lot of like healthy ways to use smart paths that produce really different numbers of passes and even really different like numbers of passes per person. Right? Because our initial, the next thing we tried was, okay, can we just normalize by the number of users? Right? Can we do something like passes per student or passes per teacher? But again, like there are wildly different usage patterns that could result in wildly different numbers. The same was true, from there we went to like, could we just count the active users, right? Who's creating the passes? We ran into the problem I mentioned earlier, where like, again, there are different patterns where if a school mostly gives teachers responsibility for creating passes, they will have a lower number of daily active users than if they have students, simply because there are more students. So if I'm creating the passes for all my students, I count as one daily active user. But if my 20 students each create one pass for themselves, it's 20 daily active users. So a lot of these kind of more traditional or more like obvious methods weren't working for us. And so we had to step back and think like, okay, raw number of passes wasn't working. Active user type approach wasn't working. Okay, what is actually the unit? What is the thing here that's getting used, right? It's not a user account. right? And that's when we kind of landed on, oh, okay, it's actually probably the room, right? Because if a customer creates a room, that's, they're intending for passes to be created to or from that room, and that's kind of how we landed on that as our key user engagement metric. And obviously, we've been working on defining the metrics that contribute to that, but
Mm.
that's kind of our like high level. How do we tell that user engagement is improving? And if that's
Right.
true, we should see a higher, the way we call it, the room utilization rate, right? Like
Mm.
what are the number of active rooms in a given period divided by the number of total rooms available in that period.
Right, right. That's awesome. Now, before we go to like the evaluation criteria and how it transformed from startup to after the acquisition,
Mhm.
there's another thing that was in the chat on the relationship between that metric of engagement or utilization,
Mm.
passes created, rooms used, to the revenue model of the product.
Yeah, yeah. It's we just do the standard K-12 EdTech thing, which is we charge based on the number of students. And like I said,
Okay,
yeah, I mean
okay.
that's if you depart from that at all in K-12 EdTech, you make your sales conversations a lot harder.
Okay, okay, that makes sense. So then this was, as you mentioned earlier, this was a predictor of the engagement level of churn and customer satisfaction, right? That
Yeah. And in
okay.
that case, we had some historical data that we could use to like sketch that in. But again, we
Mm,
didn't have the level of fidelity or of granularity that we get from event tracking. So I would say
mm,
our hypothesis that the product metric of room utilization rate drives the business metric of customer retention.
mm.
I'd say at this point we're moderately confident in that hypothesis, but that could turn out to be a weaker correlation than we think once we've got more data.
I think we should go into the evaluation process. So,
Yeah, okay, okay.
what are the three or four tools
That's good.
you evaluated?
Yeah, yeah. So I would want to start with like what is your evaluation criteria?
Mhm,
What was it when you were a startup, when you were looking at various things? What does it need?
mhm,
Residency of data and stuff like that. And then
mhm,
how did it change when the
mhm,
acquisition
mhm.
happened? Did it become tighter, looser?
Yeah, yeah. And I think it's going to be hard to talk about this without like being concrete about who the runners were at each stage, because I think that will kind of help illustrate the change. So prior to acquisition, and even like early in the process, right? Like it took some time for us to understand how the acquisition changed the context for this. So it wasn't literally like we got acquired and then everything changed. But while we were still operating under that pre-acquisition mindset, RudderStack was our front runner, right? And some reasons for that, right? Like context there, RudderStack did pretty well on meeting our student data privacy requirement. There's a single step in the pipeline for RudderStack that happens on RudderStack servers, but the data there is deleted very rapidly. Um, and obviously like the long-term storage and everything else happens in our software and in our stack. So because we were smaller, we were willing to make that trade-off for some of the advantages of RudderStack. RudderStack's pretty easy to set up. Unlike a lot of tools in the warehouse native space, it's as easy to get started as it is with like a mixed panel. The other piece is that RudderStack has some features like reverse ETL that were really important to us because we didn't already have good solutions for that, right? And so that early on gave the advantage to RudderStack. So what you can see from there, right, is like our top requirements were making sure that we could meet expectations around student data privacy. And it had to be warehouse native because the thing we cared about was not something that any of the off-the-shelf tools model themselves. We knew we were going to have to do our own modeling after landing the data in the warehouse. Once we were acquired and like started to understand the new context, Snowplow took the lead for us. And some of the big changes there, right? Like we were suddenly much bigger and in a space where security is even more important than it is in other areas for K-12 ed tech, which means we were going to be under more scrutiny, which means we had a lot less appetite for the privacy risks. Now, we had the other thing that was different is, we were before the acquisition, we were working from like a really bare bones analytics stack. We just had BigQuery, and then we had Metabase to help us run SQL queries on BigQuery, and really like nothing else. But after the acquisition, we actually had a fairly mature data stack based on Microsoft Fabric. Sounds weird to call it a mature data stack based on Microsoft Fabric because Fabric itself isn't very mature, but we were getting a great deal on it as well, right? But like we had a lot of existing stuff we could leverage. And that led to that meant a couple different things, right? One, integration with Microsoft Fabric was important. Snowplow already had it. RaptorTech was willing to commit to doing it. Based on my research, it actually wouldn't have taken them that long. And actually, I should be more specific about my research. My research is asking Istvan from Mitsu how long it would take his team to do it, and he said, I don't know, probably 4 to 6 weeks. And then he got back to me recently, said, "Oh, we just built the thing, so it really should only take that long." But the other big piece of it is that we didn't need the reverse ETL anymore, and some of the other things that RaptorTech could do, we didn't have those gaps in our stack anymore.
Nice.
Now, the last big thing, right, the ease of implementation piece, that also changed, right? In this new context, we actually had just like a lot more person hours that we could put on this because it is also a high priority for the new parent. And so, like the short version of that is, when the dust settled, all the pre-acquisition advantages that RaptorTech had over Snowplow were kind of moot in the new context. But the disadvantages RaptorTech had versus Snowplow were still there. And that's kind of, how we ended up making the choice we did.
Nice. Can you highlight some of those disadvantages that RaptorTech had in comparison to Snowflow?
Yeah, so the biggest disadvantage was that RudderStack did involve some unavoidable third-party data processing, right? So like
Good
student
to know.
data was gonna touch RudderStack servers, and that's more risk than the data never touching RudderStack servers. The other thing that it wasn't a disadvantage before, it was only a disadvantage after, is that after, we had a new requirement that whatever we chose had to integrate with Microsoft Fabric. And again, like I'm pretty confident RudderStack would have been able to meet that requirement on our timeline. But, when you're having those internal discussions and you're looking at, RudderStack is a bit more risky, both in terms of the timeline for Fabric integration and in terms of the data privacy. You have to have like a really compelling reason to choose that solution over the one that doesn't have those risks. And so that's kind of how we ended up making the decision.
Okay. And in terms of data collection, did you like consider how Snowplow enables data collection versus RaptorStack's data collection?
Yeah, honestly, in that point, and in terms of developer experience for like building instrumentation, they're really similar. I mean, there wasn't a huge difference. So that ended up not being a huge part of the requirement. And also like price. Like RudderStack was at a glance, Snowplow was going to be cheaper because you don't pay Snowplow for as much. Like Snowplow doesn't do as much. It doesn't do as like much in your stack as RudderStack does. So you pay less for it. And you pay Snowplow transfers more of the infrastructure costs to the customer because it's all running on your own infrastructure. We were getting such a great deal on the infrastructure that that made it so that Snowplow's first proposal was less expensive, but RudderStack was really motivated to meet that. So in the end, like the overall cost of ownership was looking pretty similar. So
Okay.
that wasn't a huge factor either. Cost of ownership and like developer experience were roughly similar.
Okay. Okay. I'm not sure if you already answered this, but did you also look into segment and high touch or any other?
We looked into we looked into segment, but only because we had to. So this is a weird thing, right? I've done this a bunch of times for ed tech companies, right? And like one of the ways we sped up the process is that I've actually done a lot of work choosing the right tool for companies in this situation. So I was like able pretty quickly to form the hypothesis that our shortlist should really be RudderStack and Snowplow. A little later in the game, I learned that like Meta Router might have been a decent addition to the shortlist, but honestly, by the time I realized that, we were late enough and like comfortable enough with Snowplow that the ROI on like restarting the process or putting a vendor again at the start of the process, we were unlikely to discover some difference between Meta Router and Snowplow that would make it worth it. Segment, we did a brief evaluation of Segment simply because it was the first thing all our internal stakeholders mentioned. And so it was important for the process to be able to articulate why Segment wasn't a good choice. And the main thing is that the privacy risks with Segment are just a lot higher than they are with RudderStack. And so there was no reason to consider Segment if we were already considering RaptorTech. Is basically the short version.
Good, nice. And you already mentioned that your stack was more mature, so you don't even really look into a full fledged CDP, did you? Like
No,
your
no, we didn't really have much need for a fully fleshed CDP. Yeah, the real thing we needed was event collection. And, in that pre-acquisition mindset, the fact that RudderStack could do things at some other parts of the stack was helpful because we also had those gaps. But, post-acquisition, the fact that Segment can do so much doesn't matter to
It's very
us.
interesting because for a lot of vendors, that's often the selling point, right? Like we'll do this and this and this and this and that. But Snowplow is probably the only vendor. Maybe there's actually the one or two other open source vendors that are just focused on the
Yeah,
event.
very thin layer.
Um, yeah, which I think is great. And again, in my experience, like not a lot of people really understand the importance of going with a more focused solution. Like I'm not saying the more focused solution is always the right solution, but if you don't really have a need for all of those, like you said, you didn't have a need for reverse ETL at all because you were going with a very
Yeah,
focused solution,
and
right?
it's part of what makes these decisions so fun, right? Because like I've done this so much, and one of the companies I've been advising recently is a B2C subscription app, right?
Okay.
In EdTech, and they just use Mixpanel, right? And they were like, "Hey, should we do X, Y, or Z?" And Mixpanel is totally sufficient. You're already using it, right? Like it's a great fit for what your needs are. You don't have these privacy concerns. The main things you care about are sort of classic, B2C pirate metrics. You're
Yeah,
set. Don't get fancy about it. But like
let's see about
the
it.
details really matter, right? When it comes to choosing the right solution. And it can be, it can be helpful to be able to tap someone else's expertise and at least like just like narrowing the consideration space a bit.
Got it.
So you're not spending a bunch of time exploring something that really isn't appropriate for what you're working.
Yeah. Deb, do you have any question?
Yeah, before we go away from this evaluation process, you mentioned jobs to be done, and you've said that you're a product manager, so I know you would know this language. There is this notion of push pull anxiety inertia, the four quadrant, right? And you are coming from a position where you're problem aware, you're evaluating solutions, and you've also mentioned some table stakes hard passes like privacy issues obviously is
Yep.
very very important and things like that. I want to go into the layer of stakeholders also changing because of your circumstance, like there are people in
Hmm.
the group and you mentioned that business stakeholders. What were like the functional things, and what if any were friction in this evaluation process when you're looking at these tooling where user wants to do this and you have to make a trade-off in whichever way you go, right? Can you illustrate
Yeah,
some
yeah.
example there?
I mean, I think this is one of the things that should be a little painful if you're doing it right. And so, like, the anti-pattern is something where different functions in the organization choose their own tools based on their specific local needs. And then that incurs a kind of technical debt in your analytics stack, right? Because eventually you've got to either do the work of sunsetting those tools and centralizing, or you've got to do the work of getting those tools talking to one. And that's even setting aside the work of like, getting the tools to speak a shared language of like data, right? And so, I think if I'm of the product management school where like measurement is an essential part of the planning process, and like I feel like it's absurdly risky to build things when you don't know how you're going to measure them and you don't implement the measurement. My professional opinion is that it's worth that pain up front to make sure that you're measuring things in consistent and scalable ways, and you're measuring things in ways that all the stakeholders can trust. Because one of the sneaky ways that like a bad data stack decreases your velocity is that if it's not high trust, you end up spending a ton of time on like trust conversations, right? Like, can I trust this metric, right? What's it based on? How is it measured? And
Yeah.
that adds up really quickly in terms of slowing you down. And so, yeah, so whenever I've worked on this, I've tried to really embrace that process. And I'm really like, it's just product management. You're the product manager for an internal product, right? Your data stack is a product. And you have to work on it like a product and try to triangulate among the needs of different users and really understand deeply the problems they're trying to solve with data tooling, again, so that you can just come up with the most effective solutions. Question about what do you do to make it high trust, which is great because I think it's a really important one. I think there's like the squishy answer and then like the hard technical answer, right? Like the squishy answer is the same for stakeholder management in general, right? Like people need to feel like they have a voice in the process. They need to feel like you're listening to them. You need to understand what their needs are. You need to like actually meet them, right? I found that once you understand the needs of a bunch of different stakeholders, it's really rare that their needs are like actually in direct conflict, right? Like usually, there's a lot of overlap in the needs, and you can satisfy a bunch of people if you do that work. Now, the like hard version of the answer, right, is it's around a lot of those annoying details with like metric definition, right, and like centralizing metric definition, centralizing how you're calculating things, documenting how you're calculating things, right, and like involving these stakeholders in the process of defining the metric. Right? So early on, I was talking about that active rooms metric, and then the metrics derived from that. Right, that wasn't me sitting in some room, right? That whole process was like a collaborative development process with internal customers, and like working on iterating on that metric and then aligning on something that we felt would work, but then also aligning on like how are we going to measure the metric, right? How are we going to measure whether the metric is working, right? And so like that's kind of a way to make it higher trust. But if I were going to point to one like tactical thing to increase trust in the system, if you're going to do one thing, it's like centralize all your models, right? Centralize all your metric definitions. So like there is one source of truth about how you're counting daily active users, right? There's one source of truth. That's one of the advantages of a warehouse-based analytics stack, even if you don't have the other requirements that exist in EdTech. It makes it a little easier to centralize just how you're counting things.
Yeah, you just touched upon a lot of the great points. I wanted to steer the conversation in this direction about, how do you prepare internally the things you think about, the discussion you need to have, the things you need to
Hmm.
document, mention all of that. But if you had to put on your consultant hat and let's say you're
Hmm.
talking to a client who's looking for help with the evaluation process, what would you like? What would be your biggest caveat for them? Like, what is that they must know as they go into this process, whether they hire you or not?
Mm.
And then, like most companies are like,
Yeah,
we're really not sure how to understand the differences. They just go and like schedule a bunch of demos, but we all know how those demos go.
yeah,
What is it that they
yeah,
can do
yeah, exactly.
before they schedule those
So,
demos?
I have like an uncomfortable answer to that may cost
We
me
want the
clients.
uncomfortable answer, yeah.
But the uncomfortable answer, it's okay. The uncomfortable answer is that like whatever you do, whatever tool you choose for any slice of your product analytics stack,
Hmm.
there's like a very low and very hard ceiling on how much value you'll get from it if you don't have like a clearly articulated strategy for your product, and if you don't have a clear sense of what the handful of like 3 to 5 metrics that matter are for that product. Because like
Yes.
the best process is always working back from.
Music to my ears. Thank you.
And
Yeah.
again, like that's the process I described. We for Raptor, right? We realized the thing we needed to measure was all around active rooms, right? And we decided that, like, we didn't decide it before starting the process entirely, but we decided it before getting too deep into the process, right? We understood what we needed to be able to measure. Now, I think that that's part of the like thesis behind the consulting firm my business partner and I are starting, which is that like it's really hard to do this process well without both a product person and a data engineer,
Yeah.
right? And there
Yeah.
are a handful of people out there who can do both. I've met a few of them. They're awesome. There aren't that many of them, right? Yeah, is that you, Deb? That's great. That's great. If you can find a Deb, hire a Deb. But there aren't a lot of Debs out there, so I think that's kind of the niche we're trying to fill, to be
Yeah.
able to give both sides of that perspective.
Yeah. I think you're definitely solving a pain point that hasn't really been solved.
Hmm.
Um, because it's not a shiny, sexy business, right?
Yeah,
It's a lot of work, but it's
yeah.
it's really important pain points.
But I tell you what, when it clicks, it's so satisfying, right? You can see like, good measurement is such a foundational need for so many of the like great product management practices out there, right? Like you can't listen to Teresa Torres unless you've got good measurement, right? You can't listen to Melissa Perry unless you've got good measurement, right? You can't listen to Marty Kagan for most of the time if you don't have good measurement. And so, it is sort of, in a lot of ways it's unsexy, but it's really satisfying. If there
Yeah.
are American football fans out there, it'll probably be no surprise to any of you that back in my playing days, I was an offensive lineman, right? Like
Okay.
unglamorous, but if you look at any big play, there's a quiet play by an offensive lineman that makes it happen.
That's nice. That's good to know.
Yeah,
Thank you.
that's awesome. I mean, there's actually a similar pattern here. So, like, I used to be a distributed systems engineer before
Mm.
and worked as all these early days of big data and analytics and real time, all of that before I got into technical product management. And this absolutely resonates well because, like, the surface level knowledge, I suppose, is ubiquitous and everyone knows it. But double click like 3 times and get into
Mhm.
that's when really it becomes more uncomfortable. But there's also, I was gonna say, a pattern in which Arpit and I, and in the database and in the context of this jam session, is somewhat like aligned with your consulting vision, whereby there's a lot of fluff out there, there's a lot of noise, but I think like this
Mhm.
just, it's not that hard if you get started and spend a few reps doing this
Yeah,
work, right?
yeah.
And we want
And
to
that's the
make
key.
it,
It takes a
yeah,
few reps to get familiar with it. I think it can be hard to find, opportunities to do those reps. But yeah, I think you're exactly right. It's not like in the end, it's not rocket science, right? It's a bunch of experience, like thoughtful experience that you can apply to new situations.
right. So, want to ask a little bit about the rollout now, assuming that you
Yeah.
obviously made the vendor choice and how the rollout happened, and how people got sort of onboarded and activated in that context.
Yeah, so the rollout starts next week. So our onboarding call is next week. Now this is another place where like having done the reps really helps. Like Matt and I at the last company where we worked together, we implemented Snowplow. We know how it's going to go, and so I'm really confident that it's going to be fine. And our deadline, right, is we need to be collecting this data before the start of the new school year here in the US, right? Because we don't want to lose data. We want to have 100% of what we want at the start of the new school year. And we've got a pretty comfortable timeline for getting
Is that September, or here it's September in
mid
Canada?
August. Yeah,
Mid
mid
August. Okay, so a
August.
little bit
Yeah.
early. Okay. Okay, gotcha, gotcha. And most of the thing, just what I heard, want to clarify, is all internal, and you will be the consumer of that. You're not passing anything down to the customer.
That's correct. Yeah. We haven't ruled that out in the future. Like the stack we're working on makes that possible. In fact, like Raptor recently released for a different part of the product portfolio, recently released some customer facing analytics that is run off of our data warehouse tools and fabric. And
Okay.
so like that's definitely a possibility down the line. But we're earlier on in the process. We need to start collecting the data, and then that unlocks a whole bunch of opportunities for us to use the data in ways that provide value internally.
Yeah, yeah, and so as the rollout happens now, your next few months would essentially just be building out or porting rather and enhancing all of the query patterns that would validate whatever the logic is on these events to mesh with all that already
Yeah,
exists, right?
yeah. So there are kind of three major areas of work that we need to get done before back to school. The first area is just like the initial snowplow infrastructure setup. Snowplow works with some really huge companies that take a long time to do that sort of thing. We did it in less than a month the last time Matt and I did it in a similar context to where we're doing it now. I don't think it will take all that long, especially because we already did a proof of concept with RudderStack, and the way we wrote the instrumentation patterns in our code base, it's really, all but a few like a few little lines. We'll transfer it to how we're doing it in Snowplow. The second piece of it is actually building the instrumentation, right? So like we have no instrumentation right now, right? And so we have this like a fairly deep backlog of important events that we need to instrument. That's the kind of thing that like what is it? It's like high work, low risk, right? Like it's not hard to figure out how to build a new event using these tools, but we have a lot of events to build, so it's going to take some time. And then the third thing is actually something we can do shortly after the start of the school year, right? The school year deadline is about collecting the events themselves and landing them in our warehouse. The like modeling and observability, it's okay if that lags a little bit after the start of the school year. And our timeline allows for that. So honestly, like at a K-12 EdTech company, you're not looking at any graphs. Like you're not doing any product analytics in the first, month of the school year. You're looking at, New Relic a lot. You're looking at a lot of, errors, and you're looking at bug reports, but you're not really coming at analytics with the discovery mindset. So we can wait a little bit for that.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. I just wanted to contextualize this. We've talked about use case. This is more from the vendor side of things, or people who are probably not part of the industry, to think about the temporal aspect of this evaluation, right? And there
Mm.
are obviously wrenches in the mix, like acquisition in your case. But when does it start, and what is kind of the seasonality? And you mentioned about the deadline of getting live by collection by before the start of the school year. So there must be some like testing and other stuff planned there as well. But can you maybe just paint a picture of the timeline, if you will, like from start to finish, so people get a concept
Yeah.
of how much it takes?
Yeah,
Yeah.
so we knew this was one of our priorities for H1 2025. In terms of like how much bandwidth we allocated to it during the discovery process, it was part of my time and part of an engineer's time, right? Now that we have something to actually implement, it's going to be 2.5 months where we've got an engineer working on it full time and me working on it part time. I've been in other situations where that process was really condensed. I do think that the acquisition slowed us down, right? Like heading into H1, we were actually aiming to have something implemented by the end of Q1, but we had to take more time to sort of regroup and revisit the process once the dust settled after acquisition. Not
Okay.
that the dust is settled; it takes a lot longer than a few months, but the dust was settled on this question within a few months of the acquisition.
Does the timeline also include the evaluation process or just the implementation? Just to
That's the
clarify.
evaluation process, yeah. So,
Okay. Like evaluation implementation, 2.5 months, you said.
no, evaluation and implementation in calendar time, we will have ended up spending about 6 months.
But that's also because of the break, because of the
Partly because of the acquisition.
yeah, okay.
There have been times before, again, like taking the shortcuts of having had a lot of experience and the shortcut of being able to develop like the shortlist for evaluation
Yeah.
really like in a day. And a day is even generous, right? Like at this point, I've got some patterns where certain kinds of customers, I would say, hey, this is probably your shortlist, right?
Exactly.
In those scenarios, I've done this in the order of 4 to 6 weeks, like evaluation plus implementation. The things that make the process for Raptor longer is because the product is more mature, we have a deeper backlog of instrumentation to build before we launch. And again, it took us some time to figure out how to operate in the new company, even beyond just like understanding the new requirements in the new company, like figuring out who could write the checks and like figuring out who needs to be involved in these decisions. It takes some time when you get acquired. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. That makes a ton of sense. I mean, thank you for sharing all of this. So right now, obviously, if I were just like play it back and summarize, you had a short list. You knew it was rudder stack or segment, and then it became snowplow
Right. Rudder
because
stack,
obviously.
rudder stack or snowplow was the short list. We made it on the short list because that was the easiest way to communicate why we shouldn't use segment. I don't want to come across as a segment hater. Like I've used segment in previous scenarios. There are situations where it is absolutely the right choice and belong on our short list, but we had to communicate.
There's so much useful stuff in this conversation, a lot of useful nuggets, and yeah, unless you have anything else to add, Justin.
Maybe just plug your consulting thing again, like
Yeah,
just
yeah,
your
I'll plug the
UVP, right,
consulting thing
Justin?
again for sure.
How much time would a client save by how much time would they save in the evaluation?
In
If
the
you forget about
evaluation process.
implementation,
Yeah. I think if you had to familiarize yourself with both, like what are the tools available on the market, and if you had to familiarize yourself with like what are the important factors in shaping the tools that belong in your shortlist and the tools that you eventually choose. I'm thinking back to when I was first starting in this, like it probably took a quarter, and that's a quarter in calendar time, right? It wasn't my full-time job. But the first time I had to come up with this, it probably took about a quarter. So I think we could save you a quarter, right? If
nice.
just the fact of being able to get you to a short list and help you understand what the key factors are.
Also help
Yeah.
you choose the right tool,
Yep. Help you
which
choose the right tool.
is a huge consideration, right? Getting that
Yeah.
is like a really costly affair.
Yeah. So
Awesome.
if you do want to check us out, we are Front Range Insights. Front Range Insights. And yeah, if you look me up on LinkedIn, it's there. And the URL is super easy. It's just frontrangeinsights.
Yeah. Do share the link in the community as well, and then we'll
Sure.
we
Yeah,
share.
yeah. So FrontRangeInsights. Well, before we conclude the recording, I just want to ask you, what is the thought process behind the name?
Yeah.
Yeah, I love the Front Range. It's in Colorado. Matt lives in the Front Range urban corridor. I don't, but I sometimes wish I did. But it's meant to capture both like the sense of being at the forefront of like especially understanding this current generation of warehouse native product
Yeah.
analytic tools. Range is a data word, right? So it kind of works in there. But then we thought about, front range data, front range analytics, but like the real purpose is the insights. And I think
Yeah.
that's what's different about the combination of product management and data engineering, right?
Mm.
Like our process, we really start with like the insights you need and then work backwards from there to figure out, what's the stack you need
Get
to
the
be able
tools.
to answer those questions.
Hope you enjoyed and learned much from this conversation with Justin Goff from RaptorTech and Front Range Insights. Arpit and I obviously enjoyed this conversation, and we're happy to share this with you as a source of knowledge to add to Databeats community. You can find us at databeats.community and newsletter.databeats.community. Thanks for your time, and we will have more Databeats Jam sessions soon.